This is the punishment cell, a room about 2 meters in size. Cannibalism, eating fellow prisoners, would be punishable by death, so we can imagine what happened here. This is where death sentences were carried out, somewhere around where I'm standing on these stairs. Hello, welcome to another episode of Crime Patrol. Today we're in a place that I would say is very mysterious. This is one of those places in Poland that is beautiful because of its location, hidden among the forests of the Świętokrzyski region. But on the other hand, it has its secrets. Święty Krzyż. We're here now at the Monastery on Święty Krzyż. Święty Krzyż, of course, got its name because the relics of the Holy Cross are here, given in the year 1305 or 1306, since both dates appear. But this place, this mountain, is very mysterious, also called Wysoka Góra. Well, those who have been interested in fairy tales know that here, especially on the night from April 30th to May 1st, a witches' Sabbath took place. What does that mean? Well, here the witches would fly in, of course, on their brooms. Here they would frolic with devils. All of this would last throughout the night, this famous kind of Sabbath. When the monastery was built, the monks and the bells were simply supposed to scare away those witches. Apparently, some of them still come back, and it seems that despite everything, the devils and those witches are still somewhere nearby. But the name of this mountain, besides Bald Mountain and Holy Cross, also had many other names. Sometimes it was called the Polish Sakhalin, sometimes Alcatraz, or the Mountain of Murderers. All because there was a prison here, the worst prison you could imagine for the worst criminals. Here, I would say, the worst of the worst ended up: murderers, serial killers, rapists, robbers, and a whole lot of people like that. Even those who ended up here, those, I would say, hardened criminals, said that the worst place they could possibly end up was Święty Krzyż. Why didn't prisoners want to end up here? First of all, because of the microclimate here, which caused them to contract deadly diseases at that time. It was bronchitis, it was typhus, it was what seems like ordinary pneumonia today. Above all, there was enormous humidity, winds, drafts, and of course the cold. If someone ended up in the punishment cell, which happened very often because of the strict rules here, the temperature there didn't even exceed 10 degrees even in the summer. That's why the mortality rate among prisoners was enormous. They were afraid of this place, they avoided it. Usually it was also the case that those who ended up here were sentenced to many years in prison or to life imprisonment. There were also prisoners back then who were called prisoners with no fixed release dates. Today, it's hard to imagine a prisoner like that. That means you don't know when his sentence will end. Everything depended on the court, on the authorities. If the court decided that the person serving an indefinite sentence had improved, only then could he be released from prison. There were a lot of those with indefinite sentences in the final phase. Here at Święty Krzyż, there were almost 300 of them. Literally every place here, even this clearing, bears tragic traces of everything that happened. When in the final phase of the prison, the Germans were here. They created a prison for Russian Soviet prisoners. Practically, these Soviet prisoners were kept here without being entered into any records. No one really knew who they were or what their names were. They died every day, at least several dozen of them, and of course no one really cared about it. And as proof of how terrible the conditions were, there were inscriptions in Russian in the cells at that time, which said that for cannibalism, that is, eating fellow prisoners, the penalty would be death. So we can imagine what was happening here. And in this clearing where we are, about 6,000 of these Soviet prisoners of war were buried. To be honest, as I said, no one knows what their names were. It's the year 1886, and the Tsarist authorities are closing down the monastery here. Some rooms remained, but for the most part, the monastery rooms were converted into a prison. Of course, a lot of different things were destroyed then, like historic frescoes, but of course, no one really cared about that. A Category A prison was established, theoretically. Theoretically, there were supposed to be around 400 or exactly 480 prisoners here. In reality, it was always overcrowded. There were about 700, 800, or even over 1,000 prisoners. In one cell, a cell of 25 square meters, there were 20 men. So you can imagine, a bit like rats. The aggression must have been enormous. And in all of this, of course, back then, when the prison was established, there was no light. That dampness I mentioned, those winds, all of that made the conditions truly tragic. In 1919, one of the most famous prison wardens arrived here, or perhaps the most famous one as well. And today, since he is in some way a historical figure, the prison service often refers back to this man he is talked about. He doesn't really appear in textbooks, probably because, as is often the case in the lives of every Pole, or almost every Pole, his story is complicated. Mieczysław Butwiłowicz, that was the name of this warden, Mieczysław Butwiłowicz, he came from a noble family. First, he worked in Radom, then he became the warden in Białystok. Coming here to this place, a place where, as they used to say, the devil says good night, surrounded by forests, where he had no contact with people. Well, for him it was also a kind of exile, but what was he supposed to do? He got such an order, probably got on someone's bad side back then, and in some way that's why he was sent here too. He arrives with his family and starts working here. Well, you have to admit, he was a man who was something of an innovator for his time. He also had, so to speak, prison experience himself, because he belonged to the PPS, that is, the Polish Socialist Party. The Tsar threw him in prison. He spent a few years there, so he knew prison from the inside, so to speak. Here he tried or even introduced many things that were surprising at the time. Among other things, there was a 4-grade school. Well, the students, those recidivists, bandits, murderers, could learn to read and write here. And what was, well, unthinkable at the time, as it turned out, it really was unthinkable. Women also taught here, but when the students saw women, female teachers, well, those recidivists, bandits just went crazy. They didn't know what to do with themselves. A lot of obscene gestures, vulgar language, and they also went from words to actions. And those, as they call it, various kinds of sexual behaviors also took place during lessons. Because of this, the chief decided that, well, women can't teach. And from a certain point on, only men were teaching. But in fact, you could learn to read and write because many of those who ended up here simply didn't know how. The second thing that Warden Butwiłowicz introduced was theater. That is, he wanted to establish a theater here. But it was also something of a flop. Because yes, for those who ended up here, for those bandits, well, Let's say it was a dishonor for them that he would, as they said, make a monkey out of himself and perform in the theater. On one hand, this bandit honor simply didn't allow it, and on the other hand, these people normally couldn't put two sentences together, let alone speak in the language of Shakespeare. So it was simply impossible. But the fact is there was a school. Butwiłowicz also established a library which people used. He also founded an orchestra. Well, many of those prisoners had a knack for music, for melody and all that. Every day started at 6 a.m. with one of the prisoners playing the clarinet. This place where we are is, I would say, a terrible place.
These are the punishment cells.
So, a row of single small cells where prisoners were put, thrown in as punishment. This was the highest penalty.
In a moment we will show you. We are very grateful here to the Oblate Order for allowing us to enter these rooms. They are temporarily laid out.
They are closed to visitors, so an exception was made for us so we could show you these places. But you can imagine, we will enter such a cell, an isolation room. It was 210 by 156 by 86 centimeters, with no light, no electricity, and a person lives alone in darkness.
Yeah, it's hard not to go crazy.
And actually, that's what sometimes happened. But there were also hardened prisoners who could endure even several years in such a room. Warden Butwiłowicz does what he can. He tries. There is already a school. There is a library. There is a weaving workshop. The prison orchestra plays. Despite this, the prisoners are not satisfied. The overcrowding in the prison is downright dramatic. The prisoners are quietly preparing for a revolt. And indeed, here at Święty Krzyż, there was the biggest prisoner revolt in the interwar period. Exactly on September 20th, 1925, everything started just after 7 o'clock. A group of prisoners, about 17, were going to the bathhouse. It was like this. They could take a bath every 2 weeks. Their underwear was changed every week. So a group of 17 prisoners was going to the bathhouse. But on the way, of course, they had all agreed beforehand, and at their head was Jan Kowalski, a thug, a murderer, a bandit. Well, and once a cavalry captain who served in the army and was in the cavalry. He was the leader of that rebellion. The prisoners attacked their guards. The usual ratio was 1 guard for every 4 prisoners. That day, September 20th, there were only 2 guards. The prisoners attacked him almost immediately. They beat the second one to death on the spot. Somehow he managed to escape. That's how they got 2 rifles. And they started storming the administrative offices. They broke into those rooms. There, they got a few more weapons. They cut the telephone cable. So the prison was also cut off from the outside world. There was no communication. And they were preparing to storm the main building, where there were several hundred prisoners. Well, their task was to reach the main building, to break through the main gate, and of course to get out into the outside world. A shootout started between those who were involved in the riot. Other prisoners joined them as well. The prisoners who were in the hospital, the prisoners who were preparing lunch in the cafeteria. In total, a group of about 40 prisoners tried to take over the main building. They had several rifles. They had several pistols. And a shootout began between those who were in the group of rebellious prisoners. As I said, about 40. And the guards who were at the main gate and in the main building. Butwiłowicz tried every day. He was really able to mobilize those people.
He was, in a sense, responsible for defending that building.
At the beginning, he sent one of his guards because they couldn't make contact. He sent him on a bicycle to Nova Srupia for reinforcements. That man went. But all of this took time. There was shooting. Several times they tried to storm. The prisoners tried to storm that main building. Each time the guards bravely fought them off. At some point during one of those assaults, the one who was leading them was killed.
Jan Kowalski. The prisoners lost a bit at that point, because they lost, I would say, a rather decisive leader. Besides, he had military training.
At the head of this uprising stood a certain Władysław Poczta, also a soldier. This time he was a soldier of the 25th Infantry Regiment.
Everything lasted a few hours. The shooting continued.
Some of the guards were hidden in the main building.
They tried to storm in. Somewhere in the afternoon, around 2 p.m. reinforcements arrived here. At first, they were police officers from nearby towns. Altogether, at that time, Butwiłowicz had about 103 police officers and guards at his disposal around 2 p.m., and he decided to storm in. The army was also supposed to arrive. The army was on its way somewhere. They were just gathering, but he didn't wait for the army.
He proceeded with the assault. And indeed, until late in the evening, until around 7 or 8 p.m., they were putting down the prisoners' remaining pockets of resistance. In the end, they managed to do it. Around 8 or 9 p.m., they were still hiding somewhere in the cafeteria or in the hospital. In total, 7 prisoners were killed. 11 were seriously wounded. There are different sources. The numbers vary. Among the guards, there were 2 killed. The scale of this uprising was indeed large. The one who led the uprising, that is, Władysław Poczta, a former soldier, was initially sentenced to death, but then his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. When you're here, you get the feeling that you've traveled back in time. Yes, you can feel the history, you can feel the tragedy of everything that happened here. These are all original items from that period, the bars that used to be in the window. The so-called peephole, the viewer through which the guard would look to see what was happening in the cell. This prison also had well-known, you could say, even famous prisoners. One of them was a figure I would call controversial, but a man who was one of the most outstanding figures in 19th century literature. That was Sergiusz Piasecki. I would say that you could really make a movie about him. He was a man who was an illegitimate child of a Polish nobleman and a Belarusian peasant woman. At home, they didn't speak Polish at all. This man from the very beginning had, I would say, a tendency to commit crimes. He operated on the Polish-Soviet border. He was simply a smuggler, but he also committed robberies. His robbery became famous when he held pistols in both hands and attacked Jewish merchants. A man who smuggled, cheated. On top of that, he also used cocaine. Because he operated this way, Polish intelligence simply hired him during the interwar period. But while he was working for Polish intelligence, he still committed robberies, stole, and was simply a common criminal. Then the Poles kicked him out of intelligence. After they kicked him out, he started committing crimes on a full scale. When he was caught, at first he was sentenced to death, but then his sentence was reduced to 15 years, and he ended up here at Święty Krzyż. And here he wrote books. He wrote one of the more famous novels. It's The Lover of the Great Bear. Probably some of you have seen a movie called Smugglers. It's already a few years old, but I would say it features a brilliant performance by Mr. Janusz Gajos. This is actually the story of his life, about everything that happened on the Polish-Soviet border, about those years, about what he did. It's also a great movie. For those who haven't seen it, I hope you will. I really liked it. It's also a movie about him. He wrote this book here in prison at Święty Krzyż. He himself was a troublesome prisoner. Apparently, he spent a total of 2 years in solitary confinement. So that's some kind of record, I would say, in that regard. When this novel, The Lover of the Great Bear, was published, President Mościcki read this novel, and he decided that such a man simply couldn't stay in prison. He was released on parole. He got out of prison. Then life took its course. He was in the National Defense. Then he was sought by the UB, which is the security office. He had to flee the country. He went to England, to Scotland. He lived there. His books were in what was called the WPL, in the so-called second circulation. That means they were banned. You could get them somewhere on the sly, but they were sought after, and he was the kind of author that people simply read. In the end, he never returned to the country. He died in 1964. And as I said, his life, that prisoner from Święty Krzyż, too, I would say, a bit of a national hero. That's life for a person. It's on. This is the solitary cell, a room with these dimensions, about 2 meters by 156 centimeters by 86 centimeters. This is where people were sent. Yes, prisoners were sent here for various kinds of offenses committed inside the prison. Theoretically, someone could be kept in such a solitary cell non-stop for 48 hours, then they had to be released. But in fact, it varied. Some people ended up in such solitary cells every other day. It was extremely hard to endure there. As I said, that's what the available data says, that Piasecki endured in such a solitary cell. Out of the 11 years he spent here in this prison, 2 years. There are also visible shackles there. These are shackles that were put on prisoners' ankles. At the moment when they were leaving the prison, it was like that some of the prisoners would go out, even just for that, to chop wood. They put them on their ankles. The remaining parts were tied to them with some strings or ropes to the belt, to the upper part of the torso somewhere, and only then, in this way, shackled in these chains, they could go out. Another well-known figure was Stepan Bandera. Well, of course, everyone probably knows him, or at least has heard about him. He was the leader of the Ukrainian nationalists. After his death, after the assassination of the Minister of Internal Affairs, Bronisława Piaseckiego. Here, after this trial, Bandera was sent to Święty Krzyż. Even then, he was considered a leader. Ukrainian nationalists, many of them were imprisoned here as well. They wanted to contact him at any cost. The prison warden, Butwiłowicz, he was aware of that. That Bandera was a high-risk prisoner, one of the leaders. He could cause trouble. He ordered him to be watched. He suspected that Bandera was making contact with other Ukrainians here. He didn't really know how he was doing it, although information was being passed. He only realized it at the moment when one of the guards told him that Bandera spends a long time confessing to the local chaplain, to the prison priest. To his confessor, Józef Kładoczny. He confesses for a long time, although after all he's in prison. He didn't really have many chances to commit sins. At the same time, he realized that it was Kładoczny who was passing on information. He isolated him then. And at least he managed to break those lines of communication between him and the other Ukrainian nationalists. However, sometime later, the provincial police headquarters in Lviv received information about this, that the Ukrainian nationalists would want to break Bandera out, to break him out right here. That was the plan. They were supposed to hide on the slopes of the mountain at the moment when Bandera and the others were to leave the prison for work or be in the exercise yard. Then they were to launch an assault on the prison, and in this way break Bandera out. They didn't want to take the risk. Bandera was transferred to another prison, a more well-known prison, in Ronki, located about 460 kilometers from here. But it turned out that those who wanted to break Bandera out didn't give up. Those plans surfaced again. Plans to break Bandera out, this time from the prison in Ronki, were still not abandoned. In the end, Bandera ended up there, to the prison in Brześć, on the Bug River. And there, the war practically left him there. It was already 1939. September 13th, it was already known that the Soviets were preparing to invade Poland, simply September 13th. All the prisoners from that prison were released. His further fate until finally, probably many of you know, he was killed by a KGB agent in Munich with a special pistol that sprayed cyanide. Still, Piasecki and Bandera are, I'd say, the two most famous prisoners at Święty Krzyż. This perspective that you see now was for many prisoners the last perspective in their lives. Simply here, death sentences were carried out. Somewhere about where I am, I'm standing on these stairs. A man stood with a rifle, and he aimed at the one who stood down there, and then he shot. And that one died. This was the place where prisoners were executed. Where? In what situation? It was definitely the Germans who did it. Did this happen in some way before? We simply don't know that. Nevertheless, here, this was such a place where death sentences were carried out. It is the year 1939. Here on September 4th, Chief Butwiłowicz
dostaje polecenie
in Krakow, around 4 in the morning. Around September, a column leaves the prison. About 800 prisoners escorted by guards come out. They are going to Nowa Słupia. They go after the whole column has left, after the guards have left, after the warden. It turns out that something is happening in those rooms. There is a huge commotion. Shouts, banging on cell doors. Apparently someone had been left behind in the prison. 2 monks come here, terrified by what they hear, by what's happening, and it turns out that about 300 so-called indefinite prisoners remained in the solitary cells. I told you about them at the beginning, that these are prisoners who didn't have a release date. These people were locked in solitary confinement. Presumably, they weren't taken into this column because there were too few guards, but of course, that's debatable. They remained in solitary confinement. If they themselves hadn't realized that there was no one left, that they had been abandoned to their fate, they most likely would have died of hunger. Well, they panicked and started screaming. The monks went to Father Jan Kulawi. He started calling, intervening, and in this way he saved their lives, because the guards from Nowa Słupia came back and took those 300 indefinite prisoners as well. But the next day, which was already September 5th, 18 people who had been shot were found in the cafeteria rooms. They were spies. They were German spies, or at least that's what their sentences said, so before the column left, these people were shot, eliminated. The fact is that they worked for the German Reich. When the Germans entered here, they started looking for their agents. It turned out that they had been executed. It even got to the point where they dug them up. There was an exhumation and an investigation. Of course, they wanted to find out who was behind it, who ordered them to be executed. Although everyone knew, of course, that such an order had to be given by Warden Butwiłowicz. He gave the order directly because it's assumed he himself received such an order from someone else. The Nazi Germans are also setting up a prison here. Here, Soviet prisoners of war are transported and brought in. Well, with them, no one shows any mercy at all. They die. They drop like flies, some from hunger. I told you at the beginning that there were signs here in Russian saying that cannibalism, eating fellow prisoners, would be punishable by death. So we can imagine what happened here. In total, in a short time, people die here. They will be killed, tortured to death. About 6,000 Russian prisoners of war. In fact, they are buried here nearby in the Bielnik clearing. And this is the place where they were simply transported quickly, or rather their bodies, and buried there quickly. In 1942, the prison was closed down. The monks returned here, and to this day, there is still a sanctuary, a monastery, and a place that people usually visit. Every day, thousands of people come here. By the way, many of today's prisoners are probably glad that the prison, the harsh prison at Święty Krzyż, was closed down. Indeed, as you can see from everything we've talked about today, the conditions were extremely harsh. Those are the living conditions you know about. On top of that, there was the food. They ate about 3 times a day, but it was mostly some fats, a bit of salted pork, a few vegetables, some groats, and of course the famous black prison bread. So it's certainly also true that many of these prisoners, in a way, earned their place here through their actions in life. Because after all, these were criminals, the worst of the worst, as I said at the beginning. Murderers, rapists, robbers. It was hard to imagine worse criminals at that time. And what about Chief Butwiłowicz? Chief Butwiłowicz was in hiding during World War II. He was hiding in Radom. He survived. Even after the war, he returned to service to work in the prison system. But by then, his colleagues were completely different. It was a different environment. He wasn't really seen as one of them. He was an outsider in the new Poland. Because of that, he worked there for a very short time and was probably dismissed, although the documents don't mention it. He probably didn't get any pension either, because he died in 1959, as the sources say, in terrible poverty. And that's all for today's episode. As you can see, it's an extraordinary place, a charming place, because of its location. The history is also one that chills the blood. And on top of that, maybe that's a story for a completely different channel. There are also corpses here. At least that's what the story says, although historians argue about it. There are the remains of Jarema Wisniewski, the famous hetman who is best known from Sienkiewicz's novel. So if you're planning a trip somewhere during your vacation, I think this is a good place. And that's it for today's episode. Of course, subscribe to our channel, and as always, take care.